And now we have a great segue into our next speaker. He's a prolific author who applies his understanding of technology and enterprise strategy to help organizations innovate and transform themselves. He was the CIO of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in the DHS, where he led a large digital transformation effort, moving the agency to the cloud, introducing and refining DevOps and Agile techniques, and adopting user-centric design approaches. Here to discuss the delicate art of bureaucracy, which is a nice follow-on from the conversation we just had with Paul, is Mark Schwartz, enterprise strategist at Amazon Web Services. Hey, Mark.
Hi, Alistair.
How you doing? It's good to see you again.
Same here. I'm doing great. Let's talk about bureaucracy.
That's right. Let's talk about bureaucracy. And I just asked Paul that question, and it seemed like a natural segue into this, which is how do you get the bureaucracy to start thinking about technology and, less about the process and more about the people and so on. What can you tell us from your experience in government about bureaucracy?
Nothing at all. I guess it's the same in the Canadian government. There's almost none, right?
No, not at all.
So I noticed a few things when I was in the U.S. government that made me want to write a book about bureaucracy, as dull as the topic might sound. The first one was that when people are trying to be change agents, when they're trying to do a digital transformation, sometimes bureaucracy gets in the way. And when it does, they often react with sort of a helpless, reaction, like, oh, this big bureaucracy is in my way. I can't, there's nothing I can do. And I'm pretty sure they're wrong about that. So that was my first observation. I think there are ways to transform even when confronting a bureaucracy. The second thing I noticed was that bureaucracy in some ways is necessary, not just in public sector, but in private sector, in any large organization, for a couple of reasons, the most obvious of which is we have compliance requirements. So we had to comply with, FISMA and for security. Companies have to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley and so on. These compliance frameworks almost require that you have some amount of bureaucracy. So bureaucracy is probably not going away as much as we'd like it to. And then the next conclusion that I reached from that is that there's good bureaucracy and there's bad bureaucracy. People don't like to think in those terms because, generally we don't like bureaucracy. But there's a difference. And there are certain characteristics that we see in bad bureaucracies and certain characteristics we see in good bureaucracies. And yes, there are plenty of examples of those. And so the technique that I wanted to show people is that if you're in a bad bureaucracy, one that's in the way, there are things you can do to try to turn it into a good bureaucracy. And so in my book, I talk about steps that I've seen work that could turn those bureaucratic impediments into things that actually support digital transformation. So that's where I'm coming from with writing about bureaucracy.
A lot of this stuff was very theoretical. Digital transformation, everyone talked about it. It was great. Maybe every 4 years you got up and told your voters that you were doing it. And then we had this 18-month petri dish of everything went from very theoretical to very, very real. And as Paul mentioned, things like vaccine passports and work from home technologies and so on, things that were supposed to take years took weeks. What can you tell us, having seen that theory turn into reality? Do you have concrete data on how good bureaucracies have helped and how bad ones have been overcome?
Yeah, I see plenty of examples of what's going on. It's funny that the way you put that, Paul mentioned it, the fact that we were able to do things really quickly during COVID. A lot of government agencies were. In my book, I actually say that's a pretty good measure of how much bureaucracy you have. If you compare what you were able to do during an emergency versus what you're able to do day to day, that gives you a sense of how much stuff is in the way, in a sense, anyway.
You need like Schwartz's law of bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's kind of a law. You can quibble with it, but more or less ballpark. So I think first of all, everyone should give themselves a pat on the back for what they did in responding to COVID. I mean, it's pretty amazing. We'd never seen anything like this in the world. And among our customers, one of the things we see is that the IT organizations often gained a lot of respect from the rest of their businesses from the way that they were able to so gracefully move to remote work and other things that they needed to during COVID, how they were able to scale up, scale down, do a lot of the other things that the cloud enables them to do. So in my book, actually, I talk about overcoming bureaucracy with the monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler, three different sort of personas you might adopt as you use the techniques. And one of the tricks of the sumo wrestler is this idea of never wasting a good emergency. And I saw a lot of technology organizations take good advantage of it to show people how important resilience and agility is, which is really the lesson for us, I think, from the pandemic. I often tell people we're going to have these kinds of major disruptions from time to time. And who knows what the next major disruption is going to be. Maybe it'll be another pandemic. Maybe it'll be some consequence of global warming, a war, a trade war, a natural disaster. Who knows? And the only way that we can make sure we're prepared for all of those things without knowing which is going to come is to make sure we're nice and nimble and agile and responsive to what's going on around us. So that's the main lesson I think we all learned from this experience.
Well, on Tuesday, I kicked off the series of talks with something about what I call the civilization stack, which is like if I hit a like button and it changes a tweet on your screen, thinking about the enormity of all the layers that made that happen, not just the user interface, but human language and software development as a profession and mines to pull copper out of the ground, and just the enormity of the stack is so big it boggles the mind. Like, we can't grasp the entirety of what it's taken. That someone back in the day, chopped down a tree to make a shovel to dig a mine, to get some metal to make a metal shovel to dig a mine, that eventually got to the copper in the cables. And if you trace every one of these things back, the energy from photovoltaic cells or water evaporation into rivers or the fusion of heavy elements in some other star getting squirted out into space and landing here, that enormity is huge. And it seems like the resilience that you're talking about is the immune system of that superorganism, that civilization stack is inherently brittle, but we rely on it so much as a species that we have to factor in a certain amount of adaptivity and immunity. And in many ways, the human immune system can respond and react and develop antibodies and so on, as we've learned endlessly over the last 18 months. It seems to me like cloud computing in general, and I've been a cloud proponent for quite a while, with its elasticity, is almost like a form of immune system for the brittleness of the civilization stack. Can you talk a little bit about what it is about cloud computing that makes it, that increases our resiliency as a society to those kinds of systemic problems that are going to occur?
Yeah. That's really interesting. I wish I had been on to hear you talk about that. I think what you're pointing to is the enormous complexity that there is with civilization having built in so many layers, and we've added to that a rapid pace of change in our environment. And when you put it all together, we're in a really complex world. And the one way of thinking about how to deal with complexity is to have simplify it into rigid rules. That's bureaucracy, right? We're going to do things this way and only this way. And so you don't have to be confused about all this complexity. Just do it this way. That's what we said. And that helps sometimes. However, when you add in the rapid change, I think you more need to be able to support what's more like an empirical experimental approach, where you're constantly sensing what's changing in your environment and responding to it, working incrementally and seeing the effects of what you do and so on. So that's the way that I think about it. Now to come to the cloud, I think the mistake that people sometimes make when they're thinking about the impact of the cloud is they think of it as a replacement for data centers, as a new way to buy infrastructure. It might have been that when the cloud was first introduced, but that's really not, I think, what the cloud is about these days. It's something that provides the tools for delivering IT capabilities instantly, on demand, at any scale. And those tools include, it includes infrastructure, but it's also things like machine learning, edge computing, advanced analytics, and 200 other things or so. And so the user or the companies or government agencies that are using the cloud don't need to create all these things themselves, right? Just like they don't need to generate their own electricity. They can plug into the cloud essentially and get it. And this relates to a lot of the things that Paul mentioned, right? He talked about speed and scale, and he also talked about innovation. And one of the things that we see is the cloud is a great enabler for innovation. And the reason, if you stop thinking about it just as infrastructure, is that the cloud reduces the risk of trying new things. That's always the problem with innovation, right? Innovation is necessarily risky. But with the cloud, you can reduce the risk of that kind of innovation in a number of ways. One is that you can spin up infrastructure and use services in the cloud. And then if your innovation isn't effective, you just stop using them and you stop paying for them.
I really like that. You're being more clever than you realize. I think that the cloud is an undo button. Like IT hasn't had an undo button before.
Yeah.
And as soon as you have an undo button, it's much like when we had typewriters, every word was careful because you'd have to liquid paper it out. But now we have word processors. You just type away and go delete later. It's a totally different way of writing. And you might paste in hyperlinks or notes to yourself or put some asterisks in, remember where you were. It changes how we write. And I think if I hear what you're saying, it's that the cloud gives us an undo button, which changes the way we write.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to borrow that way of saying it. I love that. It is, right? And if you have an undo button, that lowers the risk of trying something new. It also makes it possible to try out innovations because you can access the new and emerging technologies that you might want to use in your innovations. You can access the tools that you might need. You can put in place guardrails, security guardrails, and other controls, standards, as Mr. Glover was talking about. And then innovate within those guardrails.
To some extent, building on cloud microservices is a way to enforce those guardrails. You say, like, this is how you will do login. And you're no longer asking how to spec out login. You just go use a login, and it already has best practices for biometric and two-factor and salting passwords and so on. You're just building, it's like a Lego brick called login. And then as long as someone's responsible for that Lego brick being up to date, you're good. And we don't need to regulate how to write a login page, right?
Yes. I think that's a good way to think about it. We see our customers putting controls in place, these automated controls, automated policy enforcement, continuous auditing of what's going on in their cloud environments. All of these things can help make sure that you proceed with the appropriate controls and the appropriate standards. I want to throw in one other thing that I think is really important here about the cloud today, and that is the carbon footprint. It's been shown that moving workloads to AWS reduces their carbon footprint on average by an amazing 88%. This, comes from the advantages of operating at a really big scale. It comes from the fact that we design our own infrastructure to be energy efficient. It comes from the fact that we generate our own renewable energy, all of these factors. But the impact on the environment is huge.
That's fantastic. And I guess you're also, most data centers aren't built next to like a dam in Lidl, Oregon, right next to the water too. So what you lose in transmission lines alone for a data center that isn't right next to the power source is huge. I saw a lot of news around things that AWS was doing during COVID. I remember early on, DJ Patil posted some stuff that he and Werner had worked on to help data scientists analyze COVID spread and build models and get their models down from like a week to run down to a few minutes. And obviously getting inside the cycle time of the virus was huge. Can you give me other examples of stuff that you saw? We certainly saw things around vaccine appointments and CERB, but what do you see for citizen service delivery built atop cloud infrastructure?
Yeah, we really believe that the cloud has the potential to solve a lot of social problems, or to support organizations in solving social problems and advancing the state of society in general. So yeah, right there in Canada, a few good examples. The Canadian Border Service Agency. You did such a good job of getting the name of my old agency right. I'm going to try to hit the names just right. And the Public Health Agency of Canada created the Arrive Can app in April 2020. That was. So letting people entering the country letting them do contact tracing for people entering the country and track quarantine information. On AWS is hosted the government's COVID Alert application, which was created by the Canadian Digital Service. Another example, I was told BC's Provincial Health Services Authority and BC's Ministry of Health, I hope I'm getting the names right, created a vaccine management solution on AWS. The Nova Scotia Health Department is using their ClinicFlow platform on AWS to book vaccination appointments. I'm sure we could get you lots more examples if you wanted. But what we see is this fast response to situations like COVID. In some cases, these applications were created in unthinkably short spans of time and gotten out to the public. So this is what we're talking about when we say resilience in the face of unexpected disruptions.
So I want to wrap this up with a broader question here. You're a big fan of starting small and the art of the possible. And we heard some staggering statistics yesterday in an amazing workshop. I think it was Catherine Benjamin that quoted it, that said that less than 10% of IT projects in government over 10 million bucks are considered a success. And the number was like 6 or 7%. It was a staggeringly low number. And yet the smaller ones are quicker, easier to deliver. It really does seem like what you often refer to as the art of the possible. Starting small and iterating is the answer for better success, perhaps because we can now do it in press the undo button, try again, press the undo button, as opposed to, big and monolithic. We're clearly heading into a new world, and the pandemic has accelerated digital government, and with the examples you just provided, has demonstrated that starting small and iterating with what's possible is a much better way to produce success. So what would you say to people who are unconvinced that think we're going to return to a world of pre-pandemic monoliths and, this was just an emergency measure, and now that the fire alarm's gone off, we can all go back to work?
Yeah, we're not going to return. Digital techniques, I think, are the result of a long evolution in information technology. They're just the best ways that we know of to deliver IT capabilities. I love your undo button. I would add one thing to it. If you type and type and type like a maniac and don't check to see what you're typing, you're not going to take advantage of the undo button, right? The crucial point is that you work in small increments and you take feedback from your results. Feedback, might be people's opinions. It might just be things you observe or what your monitoring observes. But the idea is to create a fast feedback loop where you do something small, you see how it went, you see how you can improve it, you see what's best to build next and the highest priority to build next, and you just keep doing that, and you learn from what you're doing, and you get better and better at it, and the fear level and the risk level go down and down and down and down. So our goal at AWS is to support our government customers as they go through that process, right? As they go through the learnings, as they try things and get better and better at it. And we want to stand behind our customers and try to make sure they're successful.
So I look forward to your next book. Everything I learned about cloud computing, I learned from undo, copy, and paste. Because I think if you put those in, like pasting best practices, copying things that work, and undoing stuff that was an experiment, then that's a good way to think about cloud computing. Mark, as always, it's such a pleasure to catch up with you. It's great to meet someone who's been thinking about this stuff so deeply. And thank you for all the work that your team and those that work with you have done to keep us resilient in this crazy last 18 months. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.